afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Conniff-Tabor. I'm the editorial director of the Democracy and Culture Foundation. And we run Art for Tomorrow and the Athens Democracy Forum and a variety of other programs and projects. The Art for Tomorrow conference began here in Doha in 2015. It was a project, a conference of the New York Times. And now we continue to run the Art for Tomorrow conference annually, once a year in association with the New York Times. And now we also do a variety of events and talks as kind of a brand extension, which we're doing here. A couple of panels that we've had the pleasure of offering as part of Qatar Creates. So it's lovely to see you all. And I'm happy to welcome my colleague from Qatar Museums, Jelena Trkulja, and her panelists to the stage. Please enjoy the talk.
That was the creative lead.
Welcome everybody this afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today. To my left is Adam Weinberg, Alice Pratt Brown, director of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Welcome. In the middle is Tristram Hunt, director of Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And Arturo Galancino, director of Fondazione Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. And Zeina Arida, director of Mathaf Museum of Arab Modern Art in Doha. Welcome. So today we're going to talk about various trends that we're seeing as museum professionals. And something that we have all seen, noticed, and experienced in our work is that over the centuries, and especially in the last several decades, museums have re-examined and redefined their role, which has been moved away from aesthetic appreciation and towards the goal of serving their communities. And in the meantime, the educational role of museums has been fully understood and embraced. Lately, their social relevance, the social relevance of museums and the part they play in political and cultural changes is becoming more visible. And art museums are progressively becoming stages for social protest and arenas for debating pressing ecological, racial, cultural questions of the day. Are these new functions changing the face of a museum, and will they transform it into quite a different institution in the future? Will the social responsibility eclipse aesthetic enjoyment as the key feature of a museum? These are the questions we're going to be asking today. So I would like to begin with you, Adam, and ask you, what does social responsibility mean to you these days?
I would say vis-a-vis the museum, I think it's responsibility. I'd use also the word responsive. It's about being responsive to communities. It's about creating connections and conversations with the different communities. And at least within my institution, which is a Museum of Art of the United States, it's being able to present the work of the diversity of America so that people feel a connection and a possibility of entering into a conversation within the museum. And I think our responsibility, as much as anything, is to open that dialogue, open the conversation, so that it becomes a meeting place of ideas and that the works of art themselves are sort of, as objects, are the catalysts for those ideas.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And indeed, social responsibility is a positive word, and the museums like to see themselves as progressive and purposeful institutions, fulfilling an important social role. But social responsibility is also responsibility towards one's own values. And when those come into conflict with the politics or cultural trends of the day, the museums are obliged to engage in a social protest. So I would like to ask you, Tristan, to what extent are the museums part of the establishment, and do they have the ability to address difficult political questions and issues?
Well, good afternoon. I think museums navigate both sides of that equation. On the one hand, an organisation like the Victoria and Albert Museum, partly established by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, could not but be part of the establishment, having been around since 1852, being supported by government. Our trustees are appointed by ministers. So there is that establishment perspective, and we are, an established institution. But if we didn't speak to contemporary concerns, exactly as Adam has said, if we didn't speak to contemporary issues, if we didn't update our practices, our collections, our approaches, then we would have no relevance and we would fall. And I think museums, as with so many other cultural institutions, have to regenerate and reimagine themselves for each new generation. In Europe, if we'd said 20 or 25 years ago that newspaper circulation would fall by 90%, that traditional forms of media would be completely overthrown, people would have been skeptical. But there are such levels of change at the moment that all institutions are under challenge and under threat. And so we have this responsibility to re-energize ourselves. But we shouldn't be vehicles for political protest, and we shouldn't be vehicles for, in and of itself, political change. I regard museums as civic institutions, playing their role within civil society, helping to provide the frame and the context for those political and social discussions, whilst remaining highly trusted. And I think trust is a really important piece of this equation, because we are spaces that families and communities and individuals go to thanks to the knowledge of our curatorial and professional staff, and thanks to the nature of collections, that they can come to museums and navigate these really difficult issues around identity and culture and cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism. We help to navigate that. And if we lose that trust, if we're regarded as on one side or the other of a political dispute, then our ability to curate and navigate those conversations is lost. So it's difficult to do, not least in the current environment, not least in the way that some junior members of staff are increasingly kind of mobilized politically, and also the fact that museums, along with other cultural institutions, have always been kind of in the forefront of socio-political change at the same time. So that's the terrain in which we operate.
Trust and authority. We will come back to these two very important concepts to our conversation. But I would like to now press this question upon Jelena, who has worked in a museum in a very changing, politically charged environment in Lebanon, and ask you what role, how did your museum define itself in the context of this changing society around that was evolving around it?
Well, when we talk about museum, we talk about an institution, but also individuals behind it, and individuals who are like the artist, the board, the staff, and so in a way, the position that is very interesting and difficult at the same time is the position of the institution. So whenever the protest, for instance, when the protest started in Beirut on October 17, 2019, we took a position along with other nonprofit institutions and signed a statement, which we were just saying that we are, aligning our voice with the voice of the people in the street. But at the same time, there is a certain number of people who were like taking this decision. And it's always difficult to personify the institution, right? Because whatever we do, as you mentioned, a museum is always looked at as in somehow representing the establishment. Although Surso Museum was a free of access museum, was a very, of course, inclusive museum, like we all want to be. And at the same time, when this protest and like a series of social gatherings started, we still were looked at in a way by a part of the civil society as representing the establishment. So that was a very interesting and difficult situation for me in a way.
So would you say that you are participating in this civic context, or would you say that you actively participated in politics? Considering what your museum has done, how would you define your role there?
I think it's somehow the same. It's actually, you do need to take positions. You cannot, and I did not want to be in a like a neutral place, but the most important thing is to, like when we talk about inclusivity, is really enabling a plurality of voices. So it's like being this public space where you are accepting different debates and discourses. Some are contradictory, some are like complementary. And this is what the role of a museum is.
Perhaps sometimes that exact role of a museum depends also on what kind of political context one finds itself in. So I will turn now to Arturo. As we have seen from the news, nationalism and populism have been certainly on the rise in Italy. And as a result, in Italy's recent elections, 3 right-wing or central-right parties have seized power, came into power. And will the museums now feel equally free to display objects they want or to curate the exhibitions they want in the way they want? Or do you expect to see any change in the direction of curatorial work in museums as a consequence of this political change?
Yeah, thank you for this question. No, I think that the freedom of speech will not change in Italy at all. Of course, we're not in this danger, thank God. But of course, like my colleague said, sometimes museums are seen and they are actually part of the establishment. So maybe, especially public museum, they will be a little bit more, cautious in touching some debates. Well, concerning my institution, this is not going to happen. We like to, speak about the most relevant issues of our times through our exhibition, especially through contemporary art exhibitions, and especially during other center-right government, we were for sure not afraid of touching some hot topics, including migration. I don't know if you remember when we had this big installation of Ai Weiwei on Palazzo Strozzi, it was about migration. And we created a debate around that through the art. So we included art in a bigger discussion, which is not obvious, especially in Italy and especially in Florence. And our museum became something more than an art space because it was used in a peaceful way by some migrants for a very important protest. One day they came and they occupied peacefully Palazzo Strozzi, and so we became a microphone for their voice. They were, of course, out from culture. They were not included in. They didn't feel included in cultural life. But through our exhibition, they felt it, and that was very important. So we became a microphone for their voice, and also a bridge to give the possibility to speak with politicians and to have this voice, listen. I think we are going to continue like that, and the institution will be free.
Did you feel you're part of political life?
Yeah.
Did you feel that you're participating actively in political life? Did you see that it's changed your institution in any way when you put up such an exhibition?
I feel that all citizens participate actively in political life when they go to vote in their normal life. So also a museum director participates in political life, and when we do political exhibition, maybe our voice became a little bit stronger, but I don't feel myself.
But was it any different from the perspective of museum when you engaged in such an exhibition? Was it something relatively new? Was it something different? Was it something that, you know?
As a free thinker, when I create my program, I try to touch some important topics, and so if these topics are not sometimes easy, but I think this is part of our mission. We don't have to live in a comfort space. I think sometimes we have to dare. Yeah, this is what I feel.
Right. Please.
No, I was just going to say, I think that, at least for me, the question of museums or the museum is not the question in a way, because if I think of the four of our institutions, they are four very different kinds of institutions and completely different cultures with completely different origin stories. And there isn't the singular museum. What do we have in common is we display objects, we center object as part of the dialogue, and the protection of those objects, the care of those objects, the interpretation of those objects, the discussion about those objects. But when I think of our museum at the Whitney is very much, I like to think of as art in real time. So where I see a slight difference, for example, with Tristan is we don't exist for the purpose of protest, but because we are participating in the social activities, we're the voices of, as you said, the microphone for the artists of this generation. We can't avoid the politics. As one of my trustees once said to me, she said, you always say that you want the Whitney to be part of the discussion, but that means you don't always get to choose the discussion. And I really feel that's true, that if we are being responsive to the community and involved in the artist community and in the making of art, we have to participate in that. That doesn't mean, and I agree with Tristan, our job is not to take an advocacy point of view, is not to push for social change per se, but we can't avoid that as being part of what comes into at least our institution, and each institution responds to that in a different way.
Do you think that perhaps the society these days might expect of you to push for social change? Because one of the reasons why we're seeing these constant protests in museums these days, mostly by climate change groups and other groups fighting against environmental destruction and so on, seem to be that they're perceiving all of the museums as establishment and a very conservative establishment that is protecting the status quo.
Well, two things I just say very quickly to that, because I want to hear what my colleagues have to say. Number one, I always posit the idea that the Whitney Museum as a museum is both the establishment and against the establishment at the same time. We are the establishment. Our money comes from corporate sources, private sources, and all of that. But at the same time, we show art that actually are very much often in counter to the positions of the people who are our funders and our supporters. That's number one. The other thing is, I'll give you an example. I was asked recently by an artist, an Iranian artist, that why isn't the Whitney Museum making a statement in support of what is going on in Iran right now? And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and it's not our role as a museum to stand up and say what our position is on each one. We are, and this is, I like your term, the microphone for the artists who want to address those issues. Because otherwise, there's not going to, every week, we're going to have to be saying, we're in favor of this, we're against that. And then we become totally political positions. And to me, art is much richer, more complex, more interesting. It offers alternatives and much more subtle ways of looking at things where political things, and we have a politician, a foreign politician here, where I think politics become very much about lines and about drawing lines and about separation and not necessarily about bringing things together.
And I think the point is one does it through the exhibitions, the collections, the programs. We at the V&A, we had a very successful summer event with the British Pakistani heritage artist Osman Yusufzada, reflecting on 75 years of partition, of India-Pakistan partition, reflecting then on multiculturalism, reflecting then on nature of race in Britain, all of these, in a sense, were political ideas, but we framed it through the V&A, which itself has a colonial and imperial history. So there was a relationship with us, the institution, as part of that history, challenged to us as an institution and our institutional history, but also through, wondrous installations and beauty. Don't forget beauty in all of this conversation. Beautiful installations and beautiful art made some really powerful points about contemporary issues. But we did not issue a statement on 75 years of, as it were, British relationships with the Indian subcontinent. What we did was provide a program which provided, I'll go back to it, the civic space and the civic context for those conversations.
Yes, I wanted to say, I think that it's our role as museums to actually tackle contemporary issues. And I mean, if we want to be relevant to our audience and to this very rapidly changing society, we need to look at bring on in the museum's activities, exhibitions, contemporary issues. We are not bringing answers, are not necessarily taking, we are putting questions actually.
Do you in any way feel pushed by the society, or in this case, even social media, where, or even individual artists like Adam mentioned, to engage and make a statement and take a stand on some issue? Do you feel that there is more of a call to do that now than there has been in the past? That people are assuming this is your responsibility? I mean,
Definitely, you absolutely feel that there should be statements on all sorts of issues, and clearly, the big issue of the last few years was the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter issue, at which museums then issued statements, and then, exactly as Adam says, well then there's a repercussion for that, because why haven't you then issued a statement around Iran, or haven't issued a statement around all sorts of other issues? And one can also be accused of hypocrisy and double standards and what is of interest to that institution relative to others. So one has to be careful about the institution. But again, as Adam said, the institution is more than all of us just as individuals. It's board of trustees, it's our staff, it's our colleagues, it's our members, it's our visitors. But the pressure is there.
Sure, but also you are addressing a certain context, right? You have your community, and perhaps the issues that are these communities are facing more directly than others is where you are expected to give, your opinion or do a statement.
Well, that's where why I was saying there's no such thing as the museum. It's each museum is different. So, and we were talking about this earlier, as a museum of American art, it was absolutely imperative for us to respond to the George Floyd issue, because that is right at the heart of American art and culture. But is it for us to respond to every political issue in the world? I don't know. I'm not sure that that's really the right thing. In fact, I do know. I don't think we should be doing that. So, and I think that's where there are not objective rules as to how to do this, and everything. You have sort of guidelines, but I think everything has to be almost case by case within certain guidelines, framework, and the ethos of your institution and the history of the institution.
Yeah, exactly. We are for totally different points of view. There is many things in common for sure, but maybe even more differences. So it's very difficult to find a common line about that. But yes, I think we find the pressure. I think many people are expecting something from a museum about the contemporary issues. We don't have to talk about everything, of course, but probably we have to talk about something that is touching our communities more than other issues. So that's the reason why we have been talking about migration or other things and not about many other problems in the world. Yeah.
And we should reflect, this is new. I mean, this is new, that, as it were, the predecessors in our institutions 30, 40 years ago would not have been, in the UK context, would not have been asked to have a statement on, the Northern Ireland troubles, or, issues going on in Kenya or Cyprus, or, that this is a new element of the museum. And on the one hand, one should welcome it because more and more people are interested in museums and what we have to say, and that's really interesting. On the other hand, one has to balance that against our other responsibilities as places where people can sometimes retreat from those conversations as well.
But it's interesting, you're diversifying your portfolio. I mean, you're doing way more than your predecessors did as museum directors. And museums are becoming institutions of different kind of relevance than they were in the past.
Well, again, I'll speak for our institution. I think you're right. We're being asked to do things that haven't been done before. On the other hand, the Whitney's history is a history of protest. In fact, we did an exhibition on a brief history of protest, and it was about the many different protests against the Whitney Museum and its 90-year history from all different points of view. And it shows that, at least in the case of our institution, it is about having your finger on the cultural pulse, not per se political. It's sometimes political. It could be aesthetic, it could be philosophical, it could be conceptual, and sometimes it's political. And I think that it's very hard because it's hard to have a North Star in all of that. And the North Star is about trying to be open, even-handed, trying to be democratic as possible, trying not to shut down protests for their own sake, but to understand that discussion and that museums are lightning rods in many ways. And even if we tried to be passive and removed, you know, whether it's an object that was taken, you know, during a colonial, you were automatically implicated into things. So that will become a lightning rod, maybe not at this moment, but another one. We were talking about repatriation earlier. Speaking
of protests, I wanted to ask you all a question. Since we're seeing more and more of these examples, 2 days ago there was an attack on Monet's haystacks in the museum in Potsdam. Previous week in the National Gallery with the tomato soup being thrown onto the Van Gogh's sunflowers. This summer, protest in Uffizi with protesters gluing their hands next to the Primavera, Botticelli's painting. Why do you think museums are such good stages for protest? What is it about museums that attracts the protesters? Anyone?
Well, I mean, in the UK context, this is both new and not new. So the battle for the female suffrage, the battle for women's rights, was fought in museums. The Venus Rugby was slashed as part of a publicity attempt to gain the female vote. And actually, the reason we have free entry at the Victoria and Albert Museum is that one of the responses to the threat of suffragette violence on the collection was to have free entry, so you had more people in the galleries so that the objects could be protected. So there was a progressive outcome from this moment. I think, you know...
But these days, these artworks are not being destroyed. They're just used as props.
It's social
basically.
media.
Exactly,
I mean,
exactly.
It's really 2 words. It's social media. This is people putting themselves on a stage in order to get attention to something. But you have to ask, does this really change anything? Does it really open up the question? And also, is it an understanding of how art functions even in its time? Because art is asking questions. Art is revolutionary. So you're going to attack often the art that is actually about protest. To me, and also it's a dangerous precedent. Right now, people are doing it with where there's glass on works, but it's only a matter of time that somebody does something to an artwork that doesn't have glass on it, which has been done many times before, and that's incredibly worrisome.
Yes, of course, I think we are all afraid about this kind of protest, but at the same time, they are the sign that museums are still relevant for people because they go there to protest. They think that this space can enhance their message. They can be a platform for change. At the same time, they also go there because they are seen as a place of conservatorism. By the way, they collection are there to
And
be
they're choosing iconic artworks mostly, not...
Yes, and also, I mean, these are public spaces where you have actually very valuable objects that are, you know, accessible. So somehow, and gives visibility to your action. So
I think within at the V&A, we collect the artwork of Extinction Rebellion. So we have some of their artifacts in our collection. But what worries me is some of the nihilistic language around the protests, which was, there's no place for art at a time of crisis. And I don't agree with that. That's what's there's a kind of dark undercurrent to that worries me, that actually, we should strip the walls bare and have no kind of, flummery or no beauty or no kind of, critical response to the climate crisis through art at this moment. Actually, it seems to me very important that museums are part of that conversation. So I think there's a concern in the discourse I have about some of it.
That's very interesting. It's like some sort of new iconoclasm that is on the rise. And it's interesting also because when it comes to governments, it seems that right-wing parties are winning, not just in Italy, but well, all over Europe and in the West, certainly. And on the other hand, we have a cultural movement, the so-called wokeness, which is very much also trying to restrict certain, let's say, freedom of speech or curatorial freedom. So do you feel that museums are somehow stuck between these two blocks, pushing onto them from two sides, but neither of which is actually allowing museums to be those positive tools of social engagement? I'm specifically thinking of you and of Whitney.
Hopefully, but I'm very reluctant because I think for me the most important thing that art teaches is the world is not binary. It's not this or that. Woke to say, to imply that somehow wokeness in and of itself is a negative, I don't agree with. I actually think being woke to a degree is a good thing. To be aware of the social and political conditions that are existing in our culture is critical. And there are times, absolutely, when it feels dormant. And at the time of Trump and the Whitney, in the United States, but the Whitney's become a focal point of that. It's, I think it does become critical, and and the pendulum does swing. But then, how do institutions like ours find our way through that? I think it really is about finding a balance in all of these things. And I think to try to kind of simplify it too much is not a useful question. Not that you're setting it that way, but I think that there a lot of good things have come out of the Black Lives Matter movement and the wokefulness. A lot of good things. And have some negative things come out of it? Absolutely. There's no question. But the important things that have come out of it have been really critical. And I've seen museums in America become more diverse, more attentive, reach out more inclusive, more people involved in the education programs, different people coming to museums that came before. That's really important, and that's huge. But what you don't want to do is lose a lot of the openness, the democracy, the freedom that sometimes comes on the other side. So it's hard.
I was more driving at the question of curatorial freedom and authority, precisely because of this point of that Tristan was earlier making about trust and authority that museums have as institutions. They're trusted. They have the authority because curators have freedom to express themselves. But within that new atmosphere, are the curators really fully free? I've heard of this question of curators having to ask artists every time they're going to exhibit their artworks whether artists agree with this, which in a way goes against the notion of curatorial.
And that is something that's coming up in the United States now, where a lot of museums are saying they might not display works from their collection without the permission of the artists who are living artists. And I can say there's a bit of a generational divide in that too. I happen to believe that we shouldn't have to ask if it's a work that we own within the collection, but there are many in my museum who disagree with me on that. So there are generational shifts on that. That's a whole nother discussion. So I'll hand it over to one of my colleagues.
Well, I think that we also need to think about the museums as places for research and I mean, research in a way and like the work that curators do to to do, to do their exhibitions or do the selection of artists is very important. And this is a way also somehow how we can protect the curatorial voice.
I mean, I can't think of a single acquisition or non-acquisition or exhibition idea or display or event that would have been affected by the decision around which would have been affected by so-called culture wars, either left or right. I think it's absolutely there, and it's in the ether, and it's in the content. But when it comes to the raw practicality of decision making in a museum, the research, the freedom of speech, as it were, and it's up to us as leaders to ensure that we continue to hold the space for that. That's our responsibility.
So you feel like it's been protected, that freedom of speech is protected?
Oh, totally
Yes.
protected. And you know, we are 50% funded by the British government. You know, our board of trustees is appointed by ministers, but there has not been, nor would there be, a single piece of interference by politicians in terms of our curatorial program, because you know the arm's length principle, as it's called in the UK, of letting us have the agency and autonomy to get on with it is vitally important, and that hasn't been jettisoned. So even amidst all the noise, I think that's
true in my institution, which is almost 100% private. I have a board of trustees. They provide 25% of our funding. They do not weigh in any way on what we show or what we don't show. They might not be happy all the time. They might disagree with what I do, but that is not their purview, and it is absolutely clear they have no voice. Now, that's not true in all museums in the United States. There's a lot of museums where there is influence, but it is absolutely almost a sacred principle in our institution.
I also believe it's the role of the curator and the director of the museum to prepare whatever needs to be prepared if we are to display a work that might, let's say, hurt the sensitivity of the board, or, I mean, it's a process, right? And we need to be very open during that process.
I agree with my colleagues from my side, no censorship, I said at the beginning, and then I totally agree about research. It's our role to make this kind of also difficult topic accessible, comprehensible, and to work around that instead of avoiding them. Actually, this is our job, especially now. It is about these new responsibilities that institutions have today.
Thanks. If I may return to our subtitle, the question of aesthetics. You have mentioned beauty and the importance of beauty. And you're the only one who have mentioned that. And you're the only one who is not a director of a contemporary art museum. Do you feel that perhaps when it comes to directors of contemporary art museum, they're speaking less about aesthetics because in contemporary art, aesthetics are not primary or they're not the focus? And when it comes to other institutions, the aesthetic enjoyment is still the key and the main reason why the audience
I mean, I think
there.
aesthetics are still critical. I think the notion of beauties, I tend to resist singularities because there is beauty, but it's not like there's just classical ideal Greek beauty, for example. I mean, there's dark beauty, there's comical beauty, there is, meditative beauty, there is
You're against the
intellectual
Platonic concept of beauty.
No, I'm not against it. I think that's one notion of beauty. I think that it's a marketplace of ideas. I think, and that's what we should offer, is different avenues and ways of experiencing things. Otherwise, also, we're setting even the notion of beauty in a kind of singular way. There are so many ways to find satisfaction that is beyond the physical, which I think of as what is an aesthetic beauty, is something that is beyond that, which, sometimes it might be a mental kind of, intellectual game. Other times it's just looking at it and just taking it in. I don't know. I don't.
Yeah, but I live in a city where beauty is very important. Florence and beauty, they have a special relationship for sure. But I think that beauty sometimes needs to be challenged, and this is the reason why we use our heritage, all these classical beauties, to be used for other issues. We use the Renaissance symbol of Palazzo Strozzi for talking about climate change, about the new humanism, about new future. So I think beauty should be challenging instead of celebrated sometimes. Yeah, but we still do also classical show with a lot of
Exactly. I was
beautiful
not
works.
thinking about the Greek ideal of beauty. I was thinking about the visual as being the focus, and I'm curious how it is in museums that are new and not burdened by the baggage of history, like the museums being established all over the Middle East, in Asia, and so on, that have a possibility to form their collections, to present themselves, and to communicate with the public. Where does aesthetics sit in that context? How important is it?
I mean, it's part of what we want to show, right? We want to enjoy the works we are looking at and the artists are producing. So it's still very much at the heart of museums of the 21st century, let's say. At the same time, in regions where we are building the museum sector, even like writing a history of art that is not set, it's very interesting because you are exactly, you can juggle and actually discover artists who even at their time were not relevant, but who actually today work needs to be recognized. So you have a lot of freedom, and this is what gives us a very big margin to work with aesthetics and yeah.
The good news is that Arturo and I are working on this fantastic exhibition on Donatello. So we're crossing the,
It's beautiful.
the contemporary and the modern. I think the other thing just to reflect on is then who's coming to work in museums now, and again the generational shift in terms of historically that focus on connoisseurship amongst junior curators as the key pathway to their passage through the museum sector. And again, one of my concerns slightly is for us not to lose the importance of that. And, you know, at the V&A, whether it's knowledge of ceramics or glass or jewelry or textiles or fabric, having that real understanding of the object and that connoisseurship alongside that broader socio-political context is really important. And there's a potential shift in a kind of younger generation coming through in terms of their focus and where they think, in a sense, their pathway of advancement lies, and whether it does lie in that detailed history of collections and objects as it used to.
So how different are they from their older colleagues?
Well, I'm new to the sector, so but I think there's when I mean, at the V&A, for example, we historically would hire lots of people from what was called the trade. So they would come from the auction houses. They would come with having kind of knowledge, and that's much less the case now than it used to be in the past. And it's the growth of postgraduate museum studies. It's the growth of that kind of higher education sector, which again changes, I think, the kind of the potential line of employees for museums.
I think, you know, also implied, I think, by your question, and the question of aesthetics has to do with also the notion of pleasure and pleasure in museums. And I go to museums constantly, and I think most of my colleagues go, because it does give a very profound pleasure. You know, it shouldn't be that everything you go to in a museum, it's like a lot of work and it's torturous and it's about politics. And you know, it's interesting because we talk about the younger generation, of which I have a couple, but they're also very pleasure oriented. And I think one of the things that we're challenged with is you have all these immersive, quote unquote, museums, which are all about entertainment. And I think entertainment's great. I enjoy entertainment. But we're also, on one hand, there are people who believe art should just be good for you, be didactic, should be political, blah, blah. And then on the other side, everybody, you know, those who just think it should be great, one big, great party. And by the way, it can be both. But what is the position that we have to occupy to make sure that it doesn't become pure entertainment or pure, you know, political propaganda? And we actually have to go between those poles very often. I think that's part of, to your first question, the responsibility.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting, because I did not actually connect aesthetics with entertainment at all. But through this middle point of pleasure, you explained something that didn't occur to me. That's fabulous. Since we have very little time left, I just want to ask you a very quick question. Since we went through this COVID period, I hope almost there, out of the woods, everybody has been talking about the changes that will befall the museums as a result of COVID. So far, have you seen some changes? What are the main changes? How have you perceived the effect on COVID on museums? In a few words.
I mean, I think we all are dealing with a lot of pressure in terms of financial. A lot of museums colleagues are doing less exhibitions. You want to, ship less works, pay less cost in build and construction. So somehow also probably doing much more public programs and like smaller. I mean, a more diverse set of activities than focus on temporary exhibitions, for instance.
Yeah, well, in a city like Florence, an art city, we rely a lot about tourism. So the tourism flux changed a lot in the last 2 years. Now is totally different from before the pandemic, especially composition of public. So the publics change. That's obvious. Of course, all institutions now have probably more financial problem than before. But
how is the public different now?
We don't have, in Florence now, we don't have Asian tourists anymore, for instance. We have more American than before. We are more European and also more Italian. So now we have more people than in 2019 compared to some region in the world. But a part of the world is not coming back yet. It will happen soon. And also the season of tourism changed. And now probably there is no bad season for Florence tourism. There is always good for hotels and restaurants, which is great. Before the pandemic was not like that. This was almost a dead period. It's not anymore. But it's just the first year, so we are just checking these new dynamics. But what we learned about the COVID, I think, is actually what we have been talking about now, so being relevant. So we wanted to be more public than before. So we intensify our activity of public exhibitions, so for free outside in the courtyard, on the facade, because especially when during the lockdown we were closed. This is the only thing we could do. So we
yes, you had that fabulous installation by JR.
Many others. So we called the contemporary artists to help us opening the doors, even if the doors must be shut. And so this is a lesson that we learned. And so we want to be even more open and public and to go in the direction of the people. This is probably the good lesson that we learned about this pandemic at the museum shut. Yeah.
I think there have been internal and external changes. Internal, the world of work has transformed. So, obviously Zoom and Teams, and I've got, the fear of that. And for creative organizations, that's even harder, I think. And again, there's a kind of generational shift. We will not get talent if we say you have to be in the office 5 days a week. And so, as it were, creating those ideas and creating that buzz in the organization, post-COVID, that's more of a challenge. Then externally, London, I think, like New York, has changed. I think about 1 million, the combination of Brexit plus COVID has left to about 1 million people leaving the city. And the rhythms of the city have changed. Thursday night is the new Friday night. Monday, you can get a seat on the tube now. The rhythms of the city have changed. Commuting has changed. So all that is reshaping how the museum works. And we're still kind of shaking it out at the moment. So it's a big, and it shows you the limits of leading an organization as well, because you're up against just this kind of massive cultural shift in the way people understand themselves, their work, their lives, and you have to respond to that.
And I would just say, for us, the digital audience has grown tremendously, and that is actually very exciting. We have a far more international audience. We have people who take classes at the Whitney from Indonesia, which, never would have happened. And So I think it's raising really interesting questions again about the role of museums and the experience of authentic and real objects, because that is still, I posit, what is important and what we do best. But we don't want to cut off those audiences that we've now added from around the world. So, and it's going to raise really interesting questions about, which are the same things that happen in the media. What do you charge for? Do you charge for online? Do you charge, and so that changes the whole notion of how we think about audiences and what are the financial models for organizations too. So exciting times, not boring.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I would like to take a few questions from the audience. We don't have that much time, but please, can somebody...
Hi, thank you so much for all your contributions. It was really great listening to you all. I wanted to look at the title of Museum of the Future and take it quite literally and think about new museums. Looking at the new landscape of museums are opening across the world, but thinking a lot about Africa and thinking about how these museums will relate to the new sort of renegotiations that you were discussing. Will they benefit and what can they learn from the sort of the previous landscape? I wanted to ask how you visualize the future of museums as a tool for nation building and as well as a tool for cultural sovereignty. And then maybe also thinking about how as institutions you can look to create cultural exchanges with other institutions across the world and then look at those artistic landscapes and how we can sort of create new museum networks that span across the world rather than just trying to diversify the institutions that you belong to.
Thank you. Who would like to do that?
I mean, I'd only say from it's a great question, and I think that we're going to see many more and exciting museums open in Africa in the coming years and decades. And from the V&A's perspective, again, as a museum with a colonial and imperial history, with some collections taken from Africa in the 19th century, I think we have a particular responsibility not only about sharing those collections, but also about assisting where we can and on the timelines that work for them and the systems that work for partner institutions around all those issues around conservation and security and curatorial and education that have been collated over the years. So I think there's a kind of there's an exciting opportunity, but also a kind of strong ethical sense of partnership in some institutions in the West, which also need to be part of that conversation.
I also think it's maybe this is where we're going to look at as new models for museums instead of like reflecting for the past 15 years how these museums are going to change the ones who opened 100 years ago, 50 years ago. So I guess this is what is very exciting about all these new museums.
I also think, I mean, that's been one of the benefits of COVID in a way, is there are conversations happening and happening online between large institutions and small institutions and institutions in different parts of the world, in artist spaces, in collective arts organizations. Even in New York City, all the museums get along perfectly fine, always have, even though there's always a little bit of competition. But for the first time during COVID, the directors of most of the museums were having regular meetings as a group and trying to figure out how not to duplicate resources, how to work together. And so there have been a lot of silver linings in this COVID period that I think also have happened globally as well. And I think the sense of collaboration and trying to maximize what each of our institutions could do, because none of us can do everything anyway, and we have to figure out where can we really make a difference. What are we uniquely positioned to do in terms of a local community and a national community and an international community.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I wanted to add my thanks for a very interesting discussion panel. I just drawing out some of the things that were said, and I'm a curator at the Metropolitan Museum, just so that you know I come from a museum background too. I guess I just wanted to ask about two what I see is sort of disconnects that are emerging in this question of the Museum of the Future and the spaces between aesthetics and social responsibility. One is the pathway of a curator and what their training as degrees in art history and so on, and what they're eventually expected to do once they actually get a job in a museum. That's been alluded to before, but how do you in the future, even in the present, deal with this disconnect between a person who's got a PhD in something very specific and technical and is the profound master of their particular subject, but then is completely possibly unequipped to deal with the questions that they're confronted with when they're in their job? So that's one disconnect. The other one is that when we talk about institutions engaging with politics and political and social responsibility, who is the actual decision maker or the empowered entity within this conglomerate of people that makes up an institution that is empowered to take the final position on something? Because we are seeing so much diversity of opinion within curatorial and professional ranks in an institution. We can't assume that everyone's on the same page internally. So there's a little disconnect about who finally takes a position and how is that decision made. Do you see that as a problem in the Museum of the Future? Thank you.
About the curators, I agree. Today, curators are facing topics that they were not prepared to face. But at the same time, I think institutions, they have to open their door not only to professionals specialized in some very classic art historical topics, but also to new, young people, new scholars that are more prepared to that. So I think it's the moment for collaborating and for openness. So I think it's a challenging but very exciting moment where we can link together, as Tristan said, connoisseurship and the traditional methodology of art history with all these new and very relevant and important issues. So yes, it's a moment for change in this way. Yeah. I don't know how exactly, but I think that collaboration is the key word. And we are trying to do that. For instance, we work with scientists, with sociologists. Of course, it's not my specialty, but it's what we do in Palazzo Strozzi, trying to put together different knowledge to create something different from before. Yeah, not just pure art history.
I think it's a really important question, and at the V&A we're running a program now called Curator of the Future, which is a research project specifically around this. What do we want? What are the skills and attributes we want from a contemporary curator, and then how do we go upstream to think about the training and capacities the individual will have for that? So when we've got the answer, I'll. But I think in any organization, that level of training and support is profoundly important. But I agree also with Arturo that we should be open as institutions to different skill sets and approaches. We've just appointed a curator of diasporic jewelry at the V&A, Emma Foucault, who is a practitioner. She's a Ghanaian British metalworker, goldsmith. And actually, she's bringing not only a history of making, which is very kind of V&A, but also great scholarship about contemporary Ghanaian making, and that's a very different pathway into the museum, but she's proving an absolutely fantastic curator. So I think drawing from all talents, but then having the training program is really important. And I think just on the voice of the museum, I think there are multiple voices in museums, and every department now seems to have a Twitter account and an Instagram account, and those. But ultimately, I think it is and they would say this, wouldn't they? The director with the leadership, with the support of the board, that has to take that call. And you kind of live or die by it, and it's right or wrong, and that's the job. So the voice of the museum is then established at that point, even though there will be a kind of wider ecology, which will, might have a slightly kind of, not least at Whitney, a slightly kind of, a kind of disagreeing kind of mood music at the same time, but ultimately the official voice has to be that chain, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that it does ultimately have to filter through the director. Otherwise, the institution is speaking with multiple voices, and you have chaos. But it has to do with a director who is informed and is speaking to the communities that they are responsible to. And then in terms of, the training of curators, I don't know that I can speak specifically in that sense, but if I look at how curators are today versus how they were 30 years ago, I think the curators that I see, and not just in the US or even Western, but all over, are far more responsive, I find, to their communities than they were 30 years ago. I remember a time where the curators never left their offices at all. Now, curators are educators all the time. There was a time when the education department did all the speaking, and, except for the official lecture or whatever. And you know this, you're out on the floor, I'm sure, all the time, talking to groups, meeting with individuals, meeting with students. And I think it's being part of that discussion. And I think that that's probably the kind of training, because you're not going to say train them in politics, but I think it's open to different kinds of methodologies and having people who want to interact with people, because that's who our audiences are. So maybe training.
Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you very much for today's panel. It's been very interesting, and thank you for coming.